Millionaire catches young cleaner studying in the dark. What happens next surprises everyone. The penthouse windows glowed against the midnight skyline. Inside, Ariana moved silently with a rag in one hand and a bucket in the other. Her uniform was faded, her shoes worn thin, but her eyes stayed sharp, restless, as if cleaning was only half of what her mind was doing. On the glass coffee table lay a notebook, corners frayed, pages stuffed with scribbles. When she thought no one was watching, Ariana would set down the mop, flip the notebook open, and dive into equations most professors avoided assigning past midnight. Numbers, curves, and formulas filled the page, and her hand raced across it, as if the world outside didn't exist. The sound of a door clicking broke the rhythm. She froze. Victor Hale had returned earlier than usual. His reputation carried the kind of weight that made people move aside in hallways. Billionaire investor, ruthless strategist, the kind of man whose name kept boardrooms silent. Tonight, he wasn't supposed to be here. His eyes scanned the room, sharp as glass, until they landed on her notebook. A single eyebrow lifted. "What's this?" Ariana's chest tightened. She had no script prepared for this moment. Just notes. He stepped closer, lifting the page without asking. The equations stared back at him. Notes. His tone sliced through the air. "This isn't doodling. This is advanced game theory. Why would a cleaning maid be working through Nash equilibria at midnight?" Her silence deepened the question. She didn't blink, didn't break. Victor studied her face as if weighing two impossible realities. A maid who barely earned enough to keep the lights on, or a mind that could dismantle complex financial models with a pencil. The city hummed. Outside. Inside, the air hung with tension. Ariana finally spoke, her voice low but steady. "Sometimes, the only way to keep going is to remember you were meant for something more." Victor didn't respond. He set the notebook back on the table, but his eyes didn't leave hers. For a moment, the man known for deals worth billions looked like someone cornered by a mystery he couldn't quite calculate. She lowered her gaze, picked up the rag again, and returned to wiping the glass. As if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just seen through the armor she wore every night. But the question stayed alive, hanging between them, unanswered and dangerous. What was a maid like Ariana really doing with the knowledge of an economist who could outthink him? Victor Hale leaned against the marble counter with a faint smile, watching Ariana close her notebook. At first glance, his words dripped with admiration. He said she had a mind that did not belong to mops and buckets, but his eyes told another story, sharp, calculating, already measuring whether her spark was a threat to his control. The next morning, Ariana returned to the penthouse as if nothing had changed. She dusted the glass table, polished the silver fixtures, and carried herself with quiet grace. Yet beneath the silence, Victor's judgment loomed. He had not forgotten the sight of her bent over those equations. The thought gnawed at him. A maid who could dismantle numbers faster than some of his junior analysts. By noon, the staff gathered in the lounge. Victor called Ariana forward. His tone was smooth, but his words cut like glass. He announced that her services were no longer needed. He added a cruel twist, that she was better off scrubbing floors in places that matched her real station. The others lowered their eyes, too afraid to challenge him. Ariana did not argue. She did not cry. She placed the rag neatly on the counter and nodded once. Her quietness unsettled Victor more than any protest would have. There was no begging, no collapse, only a stillness that hinted at something unfinished. What no one noticed in that moment was the thin flash drive already tucked deep into Ariana's notebook. She had found it weeks earlier while cleaning his private study. At first, she thought it was nothing, but curiosity drew her to an old laptop in the staff quarters. The files she opened revealed strange transfers, false accounts, and money trails that pointed in dangerous directions. Now, as she stepped into the elevator with her worn-out bag, that flash drive rested against her palm like a hidden weapon. She did not know exactly how she would use it yet, but she knew one thing. Victor Hale had underestimated her for the last time. Out on the street, the night air stung her face. Ariana walked without looking back. To any passerby, she looked like a woman who had just lost her job. But inside, her mind was already racing. She replayed his arrogance, his need to humiliate her, and she let it fuel the first sparks of her secret plan. She did not go home that night. Instead, she found herself sitting at a small diner with her notebook open. Equations spilled across the page, but between the lines she scribbled notes about shell companies, account numbers, and unexplained withdrawals. Each piece fit together like fragments of a puzzle, only she seemed willing to see. The humiliation had been public, but so would the truth, if she could bring the right pieces forward. For now, her silence was her shield. She let the city hum. Around her, the noise of cars and the smell of coffee wrapping her in anonymity. No one there knew that the woman scribbling on napkins carried evidence that could unravel the empire of a billionaire. Victor, meanwhile, poured himself a glass of wine in his penthouse. He congratulated himself for removing the problem. Yet beneath the comfort of wealth, a small unease lingered. He could not explain why Ariana's exit felt more like the beginning of something than the end. He dismissed the thought, but unease has a way of growing in the shadows. And Ariana? She tightened her grip on her bag as she left the diner. Tomorrow would bring risk. Tomorrow would demand choices. But tonight, she allowed herself a single vow. She had been dismissed, but she would not disappear. The question now was simple yet dangerous. How far would Ariana be willing to go to expose the truth hidden inside that flash drive? The world only saw Ariana as a maid who had been fired and discarded, but the truth was more complicated. By day, she scrubbed tables in diners and carried groceries for strangers. By night, she opened textbooks under dim light, tracing formulas with calloused fingers. Finance, economics, market patterns, subjects that once belonged only to elites like Victor Hale now belonged to her too. Every late-night page turn felt like rebellion. What nobody knew was that Ariana was not just studying for knowledge. She was tracking Victor's empire from the shadows. The numbers she once scribbled in a notebook had transformed into maps of fraud and laundering. She marked the flow of money across borders, circled shell corporations, and pieced together connections that most analysts would never dare to pursue. One evening, after pulling a double shift at a rundown cafe, Ariana sat in a corner booth with her cracked laptop. Her eyes scanned news articles, not for headlines, but for patterns buried in footnotes. That was when she discovered the name Miles Carter, an investigative journalist with a reputation for exposing corporate corruption. His work had brought down entire firms before. Ariana hesitated. Could she trust him with what she had? The decision weighed heavy. If she stayed silent, Victor's empire would keep growing unchecked. If she reached out, she risked her entire life. But the flash drive she had hidden since her last night in the penthouse demanded to be used. Its secrets were too powerful to waste. Ariana created an encrypted email, no real name, no traceable data. Her message was short. If you want the truth about Victor Hale, meet me. Midnight. No recordings, no questions about who I am. Miles read the email and almost dismissed it as another conspiracy hoax. But something about the phrasing, clean, precise, urgent, made him pause. He decided to take the risk. When Ariana arrived at the abandoned library where they had agreed to meet, she wore a plain hoodie and kept her face partially hidden. Miles, with his notepad in hand, looked cautious, but curious. "Do you know what you are walking into?" Ariana asked, her voice steady. "I know Victor Hale," Miles replied. "If you have what I think you do, then this is bigger than either of us." That was the first time Ariana felt the gravity of her choice. She did not hand him the flash drive. Not yet. Instead, she gave him fragments, transactions, names, timelines, all handwritten on scraps of paper. It was enough to keep him coming back, enough to prove she was not another dreamer with baseless claims. Their alliance began with shadows and secrecy. Ariana never revealed her real identity. She used coded phone calls, anonymous drop points, and burner numbers. Miles did not push because he knew too much pressure might make her vanish. But with each piece of information, he grew more convinced. Whoever this woman was, she had access to the kind of truth that could destroy Victor. Hell, still the danger hovered like smoke. Ariana knew Victor had eyes everywhere. Accountants, lawyers, even city officials were on his payroll. If he even suspected she was the leak, her life would not be safe. But she also knew that silence would mean surrender. Every time she walked past a luxury billboard carrying Victor's face, she remembered the night he humiliated her in front of his staff. That memory did not break her. It sharpened her resolve. Yet a question lingered in the air, one Ariana could never fully silence. What would happen if Victor discovered that the maid he had dismissed was the very person dismantling his empire, piece by piece? The alliance with Miles was fragile but powerful. She had chosen to step back into the shadows of Victor's world, but this time, she was not alone. And that raised the haunting suspense. How close could she circle his empire before the fire consumed her? Ariana was not living a life of ease, but she was not idle either. Days were filled with small freelance analyst work. To others, it looked like she was just scraping together a living. But to Ariana, every assignment was a doorway. These jobs gave her a reason to access company portals, financial records, and contracts that most people would never lay eyes on. She had learned to treat every spreadsheet like a map, each number pointing towards something hidden. One night, as she sifted through a pile of reports from a mid-tier investment firm, her eyes froze on a familiar name. A subsidiary linked back to Victor Hale's empire. The line item was small, almost invisible, but Ariana knew it was not a coincidence. Victor had always hidden his real power through layers of shell companies. She smiled faintly. The net she was weaving around him was starting to tighten. Her freelance work became her cover. While clients assumed she was just another analyst desperate for assignments, Ariana was copying files in the background. She built her archive piece by piece. Contracts, false valuations, insider payments. The flash drive she had hidden months ago was no longer alone. Now there were folders stacked with data, each one more dangerous than the last. But the deeper she went, the more she realized the risks. Every email she sent, every file she copied, carried a shadow. If Victor's team traced even one back to her, the consequences would not stop at being fired. Victor Hale was not the kind of man who forgave betrayal. Her nerves were tested the evening she revisited one of her old contacts, a mid-level accountant still working under Victor's shadow. The man owed her a quiet favor. In an empty parking lot, he handed Ariana a folder, trembling as though someone might leap out from the darkness. Inside were internal memos that linked Victor's wealth to hidden accounts overseas. Ariana thanked him with steady words, but her heartbeat raced the whole way home. She could not shake the feeling that she had just placed a target on his back, and her own. Meanwhile, Victor's instincts were stirring. In his penthouse office, he scanned through reports that his compliance team had prepared. Something was off. Transactions he thought were buried were starting to resurface. Clients were asking sharper questions. Whispers about leaks reached his ears. He slammed a glass down on his desk, shards scattering across the marble. Someone was watching. Someone was close. Victor's paranoia grew heavier with each passing day. Staff members who had once been trusted were suddenly interrogated. Phones were checked. Meetings were delayed. Ariana's name was not yet on his radar, but the walls were closing in all the same. One night, Ariana nearly lost everything. She had slipped into a restricted database through a borrowed login from an unsuspecting temp. The files inside were gold, proof of false valuations tied directly to Victor's main holdings. But as she downloaded them, an automated alert triggered. Security systems flagged unusual activity. Within seconds, her screen flashed with a warning. Unauthorized access detected. Her breath caught in her chest. She yanked out her flash drive and shut down the system, every motion sharp and urgent. At that exact moment, security guards passed through the hallway outside. Their radios crackled with voices talking about a breach. Ariana ducked into a supply closet, her hands pressed against the cold wall as the sound of footsteps drew near. For minutes that felt like hours, she stayed perfectly still. If they opened the door, it would be over. She imagined Victor standing on the other side, his smirk cutting through her fear. But the guards kept walking. The hallway emptied. Ariana waited until silence returned before slipping out, her pulse thundering in her ears. When she finally stepped into the night air, she clutched the flash drive in her pocket. This was not just information, it was survival. Each file was proof of Victor's crimes, but also proof that she was playing a game with no safety net. The city lights glimmered around her as she walked away, her face hidden under a hood. She knew she was only one mistake away from being caught. But she also knew something Victor Hale did not. His empire was not unbreakable. It was already cracking, and she was the one driving the wedge deeper. And yet, the question hung heavy. How much longer could she stay ahead of his gaze before he realized who was pulling the strings? Victor Rothwell stood under the golden lights of the ballroom, glass of champagne in hand, his laughter carrying across the room. He was hosting yet another gala, a spectacle designed not for charity as he claimed, but for power. Reporters snapped photos, investors hung on his every word, and politicians shook his hand like he was untouchable. Victor smiled too wide, spoke too loud, and bragged too often. He declared to the room that his empire was indestructible, that no regulation could bind him, that he owned the city. And the applause that followed made him believe it. But outside the walls of his glittering world, someone was listening. Ariana Cole. From a cramped apartment lit only by a desk lamp, Ariana stared at her computer screen. The files she and Miles Carter had gathered filled every folder on her desktop. Money laundering trails, offshore accounts, false charities, and the most damning of all, evidence of bribery and illegal lobbying that reached deep into government halls. The case was airtight. The empire he built on deceit was laid bare before her eyes. Yet Ariana's fingers trembled above the keyboard. If she released it, Victor's empire would collapse. But what about her family? Her younger brother still lived in the city trying to build his own life. Her mother's health was fragile, and Ariana knew Victor had ways of striking back at those who crossed him. For the first time, the weight of her double life pressed down so heavily she could barely breathe. She remembered the humiliation of being fired, the look of cold dismissal in Victor's eyes, and the years she had spent rebuilding herself in silence. The fire in her chest pushed against the fear. She picked up her phone. A message blinked from Miles. Miles Carter. We have enough. The world needs to see this. But it has to be your decision. Ariana closed her eyes. She thought of all the employees Victor had crushed under his arrogance, the communities stripped bare by his greed, the lives destroyed while he stood in rooms of silk and gold. The choice was no longer about revenge, it was about justice. With steady hands, Ariana opened the secure server Miles had prepared. She uploaded document after document, file after file. Each bar that filled on her screen felt like a heartbeat, pounding louder and louder. Her chest tightened as the final folder, marked Victor Rothwell, core evidence, reached 100%. Our wine was done. Across town, in the glow of that ballroom, Victor raised his glass higher, unaware that his empire had just been cracked wide open. The smile on his face did not yet know it was the last time he would ever feel invincible. And Ariana, sitting alone in that small apartment, whispered to herself, "This ends tonight." But as the files spread into the world, Ariana also knew one truth with chilling clarity. Victor was not a man who surrendered quietly. He was going to fight back, and when he realized who had betrayed him, his wrath would be merciless. The breaking point had been reached. There was no turning back. The storm did not begin quietly. It started with a headline that spread like wildfire across every major outlet. Victor Hale under federal investigation. At first, people thought it was a mistake. Victor had always carried himself as if laws bent around him. He was the man who said yes or no to entire markets. He was the king who built his throne out of fear and favors. But within hours, his untouchable empire began to crack. News anchors replayed his most arrogant interviews, where he mocked regulators and laughed at the idea of oversight. Now those same clips aired side by side with footage of black SUVs pulling up outside his glass towers. Federal agents in dark jackets stormed into his headquarters, their voices echoing across marble lobbies that once silenced ordinary workers. Bank accounts froze. Offshore wires were traced. Shell companies dissolved under scrutiny. For years, Victor had hidden behind complex layers of power, but Ariana's files cut through them like glass. The empire that once looked infinite now folded in real time, and the world watched every second of it. In restaurants, in offices, in living rooms, people whispered his name with a mix of shock and satisfaction. Did you see the news? Victor Hale, the one who thought he owned the city. They finally got him. Former employees who once feared to speak out now flooded hotlines with stories of harassment, threats, and corruption. His carefully crafted image as a genius leader collapsed into dust. Even Victor's allies abandoned him. Politicians he had bankrolled refused his calls. Business partners deleted his number. Invitations that once begged for his presence now vanished overnight. The man who once stood above everyone was suddenly standing alone. Victor, however, did not go down quietly. Cameras captured him striding into press conferences, shouting about conspiracies. His suit was sharp, but his eyes were wild, his tone cracking under pressure. "This is a witch hunt," he barked, pounding the podium. "I built this city. None of you would have jobs without me." But the more he shouted, the more pitiful he looked. His rage, once terrifying, now appeared desperate. Every word he spoke was replayed across the internet with sarcastic captions and mocking edits. The same world that once bowed to him now laughed at him. Behind the scenes, Ariana and Miles watched the downfall unfold. They stayed hidden, careful not to reveal how much they had fueled the storm. Ariana's heart pounded every time she saw his face on screen, a reminder of the risk she had taken. But there was also a quiet satisfaction. For the first time in years, she felt control tipping back toward justice. She was no longer the woman Victor had fired in front of everyone. She was the shadow who had pulled the right thread and watched the whole fabric unravel. The arrest came at dawn. News helicopters hovered over Victor's mansion as dozens of agents walked through his iron gates. He stood at the doorway in a robe, still trying to bark orders, still pretending the world belonged to him. But when they read him, his rights, and placed the cuffs on his wrists, silence filled the air. Neighbors watched from their lawns. Reporters shouted questions. Victor's face, once smug, now carried something unfamiliar: disbelief. The king who claimed to be untouchable had been touched, bound, and dragged into the back of a black car. And though no one spoke her name, whispers spread about an anonymous insider, someone who had delivered the final blow from the inside. People wondered who it was. Some claimed it must have been a rival. Others said it had to be a brave employee. But only Ariana knew the truth. The empire had crumbled. Justice was in motion. And yet her story was not finished. because victory always comes with a price. The storm had passed, but the world was still buzzing. Every news channel replayed the fall of Victor Hale. His empire, once ironclad, was now nothing more than scattered pieces. Yet hidden beneath the headlines was a quieter, more powerful story. The one no one yet knew. Ariana. For months, Miles Carter had worked tirelessly, piecing together not just Victor's crimes, but also the invisible hand that had guided the evidence into the light. One evening, when the chaos finally settled, he asked Ariana to meet him, not as an anonymous source this time, but face to face. She hesitated. Revealing herself meant stepping out of the shadows she had lived in for so long. But something deep within told her it was time. She arrived at a small cafe, the kind of place where no one looked twice at strangers. Miles greeted her with a steady smile. "You've carried this secret long enough," he said softly. "It's time people know who gave them back their truth." Ariana lowered her eyes, her hands wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. She thought of her mother, of the nights when the rent almost wasn't paid, of her younger siblings who once feared every knock at the door. Would shining a light on her story bring them pride, or more danger? Then Miles leaned closer. "You didn't just take down a corrupt man. You gave people hope. That matters. You matter." Those words unlocked something inside her. Ariana agreed. A week later, Miles published his most important story. It wasn't about Victor Hale. It was about Ariana Rivera, the quiet janitor who cleaned offices by day, studied finance by night, and risked everything to bring justice to an empire that thought it was untouchable. The article spread like fire. Social media hailed her as a modern hero. News anchors repeated her name with admiration. She was no longer invisible. For the first time in her life, Ariana stood in the light. Opportunities soon followed. Financial firms reached out, impressed not only with her skills, but with her courage. One in particular, a respected institution that valued integrity, offered her a position as a senior financial analyst. The title sounded surreal when she read the offer letter. Her first day at the new office felt like stepping into a different universe. No more hiding in janitor closets. No more scrubbing floors while others spoke of deals and fortunes. Now, she sat at the table, her voice carrying weight, her knowledge respected. But Ariana didn't forget where she came from. She set aside a portion of her salary to support programs for single mothers, for workers who felt stuck in invisible jobs, for young students who dreamed but lacked resources. Every step she took upward, she extended her hand downward to pull someone else with her. The most emotional moment came months later. Ariana stood in her family's new home, a modest but warm place, bought with her own earnings. The walls no longer peeled with age, the rooms echoed with laughter instead of worry. Her mother, Rosa, carefully opened a package Ariana had brought home. Inside was a framed diploma, the one Ariana had earned after years of late-night studying. Her mother's hands trembled as she hung it on the living room wall. Tears filled her eyes, but her smile was steady. "You cleaned their floors." "Misha," Rosa whispered, brushing Ariana's cheek. "Now look at you. You built your own." The family sat together that evening, sharing a simple dinner. No grand feast, no luxury, just love, safety, and pride. Ariana looked around the table at her siblings' laughter, her mother's joy, and she realized this was the victory she had always dreamed of. Not money, not fame, freedom. And so, Ariana Rivera's story became more than an article, more than a headline. It became a reminder. Empires can rise and fall, but the courage of one determined soul can change everything. Final line. Some people clean the floors of empires, until one day they rise to build their own.